the honourable member for Elmwood Transcona.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente. Les Canadiens et les Canadiennes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Canadians today are facing serious economic challenges. They can see that in prices at the grocery store, housing prices, or when it comes to how hard it is to find a job, just as employers are having trouble finding employees as well somehow. Canada is at a crossroads. Madam Speaker, we're facing the issue of how to create an equitable recovery from the pandemic. There are also major climate challenges facing us. We need to figure out how we can create a just transition for the climate and for workers. We are at a crossroads that requires leadership. This economic update would have been a time to show that leadership from this government. But instead, we essentially saw a defense of the status quo. And this is not a harmless status quo. No. It is a status quo that is working very well for the wealthiest, but that is making life very difficult for workers.
Alors,
therefore, we want to see solutions from this government, but we're not getting that in this economic update. According to us in the NDP, when we talk about broad economic questions, we need to ensure that the basic thing that we're analyzing is how to help those who are most vulnerable, both financially or for workers who may have some savings or a slightly higher income, but who are experiencing pressures due to inflation and who may be wondering if they have enough to pay the bills.
kind of at a crossroads as a country, just as we are as a world, Madam Speaker, where we are, some will tell you, and depending on the day, the Liberals will tell you that we're out of the pandemic and that the economy's back to normal and everything's good. And then when it suits their purpose, they'll tell you actually what most people know to be true anyway, which is that we're not out of the pandemic. That some things are better, but many things are still very bad, and people are still looking to find their way collectively, whether it's at the level of a country or a province, a city, a community, and individually, how they fit into what is becoming a new economy. A new economy coming out of the pandemic, to be sure, and some of the pressures that we still face around supply chains and other things that have been caused by the pandemic, but an economy that was already going to change because of climate change. And we've seen so much evidence. I look to my colleagues that are seated around me from BC who know all too well the real cost of climate and the economic consequences and the real financial cost of not dealing with climate change. So here we are at that crossroads, trying to figure out what this recovery is going to look like. Recovery from the pandemic and transition into a sustainable economy that can mitigate as much as possible the impact of climate change. And New Democrats believe that in all of this pain and all of this challenge is an opportunity to build the infrastructure and the framework for a more just economy and a better Canada. One that recognizes that it is wrong to have an economy that now, and we just heard this from the parliamentary budget officer last week, sees 25% of all the wealth produced in this country go to just 1% of the population, and asks 40% of all the people in this country to share just 1%. That wasn't always the case. And that is getting worse and worse and worse. So when we see the government defend a status quo that's creating those kinds of outcomes, you have to know it's not just defending 25% of the wealth going to 1%, it's defending the trend line that continues to see more and more of that wealth go to fewer and fewer people. And while Canada's economic pie has been growing, the proportion that goes to the 1% at the top has been growing much faster, leaving less and less for the rest of us, Madam Speaker. And so as we come out of the pandemic to the extent that we are, and I would say to the government, we are not anywhere near as far out of the pandemic as they sometimes like to pretend. And as we venture into this uncertain future with so many more extreme weather events as a result of climate change, we need to make sure that we're getting the principles right that will ensure that everybody gets to partake in a prosperous future, not just the people who already own all of the important assets. The word there is capitalism. We've had less and less regulation of the market. We've had less and less fair taxation, which has allowed the people that own assets to continue to own more and more and more. And unless there's a way to rein that in, eventually we'll get to a point where what is shared between the rest of us isn't enough for most of us. So that's why I'm very proud to be the finance critic for a party that's talking about a pandemic excess profits tax that recognizes that while many businesses have suffered through the pandemic, there are some that have done extraordinarily well when compared to their pre-pandemic performance, and that it would make sense to ask them to pay a little bit more on that extra that they've made in order to help some of the things we need to get us the rest of the way out of the pandemic and to build a just future. It's why I'm proud to be the finance critic for a party that ran on imposing a 1% wealth tax on fortunes of over $20 million. That's not a lot of people, but it's a lot of money. And it's a lot of money that can do a lot of good. And it's money that's going to people who benefit from the investments that we all make in public infrastructure. So it is right and good that when they receive such a disproportionate amount of the benefit, that they would pay proportionally more in order to create that infrastructure. And to do things that protect people at the bottom. There's been a lot of talk about inflation in this place over the last 3.5 weeks. Well, the fact of the matter is that the money that went to the financially vulnerable isn't what's driving inflation. It wasn't the CERB payments. It wasn't the wage subsidy payments. They bought groceries. They paid bills. They fixed their car. The people that were on the wage subsidy got 75% of what they were used to making. I don't know how you cause inflation when you've got a 25% decrease in your salary. So let us not pretend that the help that went to people who needed it is the cause of the inflation here. And the reason why that matters is because those folks are still hurting and they still need help. That's right. It's why it was wrong of the government to cut the CRB with just 2 days' notice. But it's also why it's wrong for them to be dragging their heels on promises like a Canada Disability benefit, something that they promised a while ago now, that people living with disabilities in Canada who aren't able to work need in order to be able to live a life with dignity. It's why they should be doing the same for seniors on the guaranteed income supplement. We've talked a little bit about the clawbacks, but I want to talk about the fact that even when it's not being clawed back, the guaranteed income supplement does not provide enough for a person to live at the poverty line.
That's why we have
It's still below the poverty line. And that is all part and parcel of working toward a time in Canada where we can have a livable basic income for everyone who needs it in Canada. We got close with the CERB. It was an interesting time, and that's why it's such an important moment, because we can say these were just temporary things, and we're out of the worst of it now. We're going to drop all these people like a brick again and get back to the status quo that led us to the point where 1% of people own 25% of the wealth, or it could be an opportunity to say that we learned how to do things differently, and that was an important moment in our history. And notwithstanding some of the very real problems with the way programs were delivered, the principle is an important lesson for our future. Today, the Liberals could have taken some real action on one of the things, the structural things that's driving inflation in Canada right now, which is in the housing market. Anyone knows, I mean, whether it's somebody trying to get into the housing market or whether it's parents that are contemplating the future of their children, everyone is worried about the housing market. And we know that a record amount of the mortgages now in Canada are actually by investors. And there are things that the government could be seriously considering, like a moratorium on real estate investment trusts, acquiring more property while the market is so hot. They could be creating an acquisition fund so that nonprofits that are in the business of creating social housing and other forms of more affordable housing could compete with some of these investors in the market to snap up buildings and land as it becomes available. Those are some of the things that they could do now in order to help bring down the temperature on the housing market and create some hope for Canadians for the future, that even if they can't afford a home tomorrow, we're on a trajectory that will allow them or their children to afford a home in 5 to 10 years. But there's nothing in here that talks about that. There's a little bit of poking around the edges, but we're in a difficult time, and it calls for real leadership and real measures. When we talk about affordability, I mean, what is one of the biggest cost pressures for Canada's seniors? It's the price of prescription drugs. And the Liberals promised an answer to this as long ago as 1997. The temptation is to get tired of talking about it because we talk about it so much and it doesn't happen. But that would be a victory for the Liberals, who have cynically promised it so often, and it would be a victory for the pharmaceutical industry that would like nothing more than for the NDP to shut up about pharmacare so that they can get on making their money without having to worry that one day we're going to do right by Canadians and organize our purchasing and make sure everyone's covered and actually save money.
Hear, 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 hear.
And I hope I get to see the day when we do that with dental care as well. There are opportunities when we talk about what to do to create employment and to fight inflation when it comes to the climate challenge as well. We ought to be out there helping people retrofit their homes to make them more efficient, to transition the way that they heat their homes off of fossil fuels. And if we do it in the right way, particularly for lower income households, we could do it in a way where they realize savings in their monthly budget. That's an investment that we absolutely have to make if we're ever going to have a hope of realizing our emission reduction targets. And it's something that could actually provide some tangible financial relief to households that are struggling right now. What better time to do it, Madam Speaker? And yet, we don't see anything here. Also, committing to a large-scale, ambitious retrofit project and a real nation-building project that's actually not about building a pipeline, but about building other critical things that we need, like a Western power grid that would allow for solar and wind energy produced in Alberta and Saskatchewan to work collaboratively with the hydro energy that we have on either end of our Western region. That's something that can create a lot of jobs. And the ambitious retrofit program together with that can create a work forecast that would allow employers in the trades to plan well into the future and, working with government, train a whole generation of tradespeople that are working on environmentally sustainable infrastructure, helping us reduce our emissions and having good, well-paid jobs building the future economy of Canada. What better time to do that? What better time to do that than now, Madam Speaker? And yet there's hardly a mention of the climate crisis in this economic statement. You'd think it hadn't happened. There's money, much needed money, for our brothers and sisters in British Columbia who are hurting after the severe weather events there, but that's just a response to what's happening. And as we heard earlier in the House here, the only proactive thing they talk about is coming up with another plan. I don't know how many times we're going to have to hear about the next great plan that the Liberals are going to come up with to finally start reducing emissions, while we're an embarrassment in the OECD with the highest emission increases.
Yeah.
Stop with the plans. Pick something and do it. This has been researched to death. When we talk about inflation, we're also talking about supply chains. And particularly, we're talking about the exposure of supply chains to things like the pandemic, which we saw, but also to the climate crisis. And we saw that in BC. And one of the inflationary pressures in Canada right now is at the Port of Vancouver that was decimated by the extreme weather events there. One solution that the government might adopt when we talk about supply chains and trying to reduce the extent to which Canadians are exposed to that kind of international pressure, is to actually talk about things that we want to make here. We heard during the pandemic that we had a hard time getting personal protective equipment and other essential medical goods. And there are a lot of Canadian companies that were lining up to say, we can do that work.
Yeah.
We can do that here. We would love nothing more than to train Canadians to do that work in our facilities. We can scale up. All we need is for the government to choose to invest in us instead of giving more money to multinational companies that have been offshoring their manufacturing for decades. So invest in us, invest in Canadian success stories, and we can do it. And that wasn't the path that the government chose. There's nothing here about talking about how we could reshore some important manufacturing. I just went to Washington, where they're contemplating things, and Canada is going to be collateral damage in their effort to reshore. But I'll tell you, we're at a disadvantage in a place like Washington because we can't talk about our automotive strategy. We can't talk about what we're going to do to ensure that future generations of Canadians get to work in a high-paying, highly unionized, not a coincidence, incidentally, sector in Canada, because we don't have a plan. So instead, we just keep reacting to what other people are doing. And that means that the U.S. is going to continue to drive the agenda, and we're going to have to continue, jumping up and down to get their attention to try and be at the table. What would be helpful would be to say, this is Canada's plan. We are looking, there's a lot of talk these days about, producing batteries for electric vehicles. Well, if Canada's going to get serious about that, we're going to need partners. China's knocking on the door. Germany's knocking on the door. The U.S. should be knocking on the door. I would love for the government to be able to show them the National Automotive Plan for Canada that's continuing our long partnership with the United States, and the one that sees Canada end up partnering with China or Germany and say, look, this is our preferred option to continue the well-integrated automotive sector that we have. Don't cut us out. And I can tell you, I believe that would have been a far more effective argument in Washington, but we refused to plan. I'm from Winnipeg, where the aerospace industry is important, just as it's important to the province of Quebec and other areas. We don't have a national plan. And we saw our government scramble in the pandemic, not knowing really what to do. And aside from the wage subsidy, which, unfortunately, the Liberals weren't open to taking advice on how to close loopholes, so ended up being abused in a number of ways. But other than the wage subsidy, there was no sense of urgency that it was important that Canada maintain passenger air service, even though we're one of the largest countries in the world with the most distance to travel. Even this place to work, for people to be represented in the House of Commons well from each part of the country requires a well-functioning passenger air service. It's a fundamental strategic asset of Canada, and yet the government had no plan, continues to have no plan. There's one-off little, doling out of money here and there, but there's no cohesive strategy for how such a strategic sector is going to be maintained and the benefits maximized. So those are just some of our reflections on this side of the House about the fall economic statement. And I think, as you can tell, Madam Speaker, the real problem with it is just not unlike the speech from the throne. We had this election because the government said, we're at a pivotal point in our history and there are big decisions that we have to make that go above and beyond what we're already doing in the House of Commons. So we have to go to the Canadian people, we have to get a mandate to meh. That's what we got out of that $600 million election that nobody except for the Prime Minister wanted. We saw that in the speech from the throne. We've seen it now in the so-called fiscal update. And it's just not good enough for the moment that we find ourselves in, where more and more Canadians are struggling to get by, while people at the top take a larger and larger share of the economic pie, while Canada is a laggard in reducing its emissions. And we've got a housing market that's getting out of control and a government that has no real proposals about what to do about it. When you look at other countries, Like New Zealand, for instance, has brought in a policy that says if you already own one home, the down payment you're going to need for your next home is going to be larger. And the next one after that, even larger. And so on. In order to discourage people from going out and who are in a financial position to snap up properties from doing it. To make sure that more people can be in a financial position to get their family home. Yeah. That's just one example of a government that's clearly serious about doing something and is being creative. There's some creative work at the municipal level we see in the city of Vancouver, former NDP MP, I might add, who's the mayor there, that is doing some interesting work and trying to figure out how to enable more density on residential lots, not so that developers can take all of that money. They're going to get some of that money. This is the worry. I mean, I think people, the guys at the top always seem to be worried that they're not going to make any money. There's a lot of money to be made while you pay your fair share. Yeah. We're not talking about them not making any money. We're talking about them making a fair amount of money and ensuring that they're reinvesting in the communities and the infrastructure that allows them to make that money in the first place. And ensuring that the people who live in the communities around their developments are able to live in dignity even if they can't buy the premium apartment on the top floor. That's what we're talking about. That's a vision for Canada I think most Canadians can get behind, but it's not one that's going to happen spontaneously on its own. It's one that's going to take some leadership. It's one that's going to take good public administration and good public policy instead of the kind of chaotic mess that we've seen here over the last number of weeks with a government that can hardly get its own legislation through the House. So, we're here to try and hold the government to account. We're here until we are the government, which I hope happens soon, to try and help them be their best selves, because it can make a big difference in the lives of a lot of Canadians. We see that with the Guaranteed Income Supplement. We have an announcement today, which is the result of a lot of public pressure. It wasn't a negotiated solution, you know that, because it's not the solution we proposed. But it is some kind of solution, and we have yet to see the details, and we're hoping that it's going to actually help. We're hoping that it's going to help quickly, but we need more. And I wish they'd stop hanging on to it for the big reveal. You know? There are some people that are living in their car waiting for that reveal who would much rather be in a home. So let's get past the suspense and the build-up, and let's get to the project of getting those people back in a home as they were just 4 months ago, before the government decided callously to claw back their GIS benefit. So that's why this is a very dissatisfying economic statement. And I hope for Canadians listening, if they don't take anything else away from this speech, it's to say that there are people in this place who are thinking about real actions that the government could actually take. We're not all just here to blow steam. We're also here to do a real job and to try and find the policies that are going to find their way to them and make a concrete difference in their life. And we're here to continue to apply that pressure and make sure that those things really happen instead of kind of passing by in a sound clip on the news and then people here thinking that the issue is settled. We're here to remind the government these issues are not settled. They won't be settled until there's real action. That's what we're here to push for. And we're going to keep pushing. We're going to keep pushing for some of these concrete things to be in their budget. They've missed the opportunity on the speech from the throne. They missed it in the fall economic statement. Let's be damn sure to have some of it in the budget. Thank you very much.